Hello, everyone. Welcome to the February 28th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting. There's a few new developments that I want to call out before we get started. One of those is that I mentioned this in a call earlier, maybe 3 or 4 calls ago, that there's a long track that we've been developing as we go through these meetings. We've moved from simple sort of push of information to a push and a pull of information to more of a feedback loop to and through different steps to actually hitting stages where we're talking about actionable data, and we're actually reviewing the parameters of the system and coming up with some debate around how those parameters should be changed. And that's led us into some of our most recent meetings where the results of these discussions have caused or initiated new proposals to come into the ecosystem, which is great. And that was the goal all along. But as we continue to progress, these meetings are going to become more complex. And I think it's time that we start clarifying what the agenda is and how we can make these things more as efficient as possible. Make sure that they sort of hew to the governance principles and the framework documents that Stephen was gracious enough to provide us ever so long ago, and that we make sure that we keep the momentum and the velocity up. And so the way that I'm thinking, and this is open to suggestion or iteration, but we start off with clarifying what the agenda of this meeting actually is. We'll take care of any kind of new events right off the top, hand over to Stephen to clarify some high-level agenda items that the foundation would like to bring to the community to discuss. Then we'll bring in guests or presenters to show us some of the data that would inform the discussion that happens afterwards. And then we head into those discussions where we hammer this stuff out and try and make sure that everybody's concerns are addressed or that their insights have been understood. And then if time allows, we'll talk about some of the interesting questions that have popped up in the community over the past week through Reddit or Twitter. And then I'm thinking that we had some interesting discussions last week. People pointed out that there's sort of 2 layers to these discussions that are emerging. One is short-term monetary policy or short-term management of the PEG, which is what we've been dealing with in the last 3 or 4 calls. And there's also room for discussion about the long-term vision. So the collateral types, the risk framework in general, what governance looks like. That's a larger discussion, a meta discussion. And we should start carving out some time in these calls to address those. And so the feeling is that at some point we might end up doing half and half, but let's revisit that question towards the end of this meeting. And at the end, if there's any random questions, we can address them there. So I'll be posting this information in the next Reddit thread about the call, where we can get a bit of a debate going and hopefully have the community help refine things a bit. So having said that, I've already wasted 8 minutes of the call, so I need to speed up. We have some really interesting things happening in this call. We have a new employee to introduce, which I am unbelievably excited about. Then I'm going to hand it off to Stephen to introduce the agenda. But so before we get going, though, Cyrus Unessi, are you in the house?
Hey, how's it going?
There
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So introduce yourself. Let us,
sure.
For people that don't know about your Twitter fame, fill us in on who you are and what you've been up to.
Hey, everyone. My name is Cyrus. I'll be working on risk management at Maker. Quick background, spent 7-8 years trading fixed income securities here in Chicago. After that, I discovered crypto. Spent some time on the investments team at Cumberland Mining, OTC crypto desk. Most recently, I was director of research and trading at Scalar Capital, crypto asset investment firm, where explored and studied dozens of crypto projects, as well as managed portfolio risk and worked on trading strategies. Academically, I have a degree in financial engineering, which is where I've learned some quantitative finance tools. My goal for risk is obviously to maintain the stability of DAI, both in the short term and help protect against tail events, looking at kind of both the quantitative aspect, markets, various risk models, as well as the qualitative common sense side of things, kind of understanding the organizations behind the collateral types, kind of getting an understanding of where the different risks lie, and going from there. Excited to be here, be a part of the team, and help Makers succeed.
I cannot wait. I think that you're like the poster definition of a good get. So I'm really excited about this transition.
Cool.
There's some amazing possibilities for interaction between these calls and the risk teams in the future, which I'm looking forward to clarifying. I think that having a really strong presence that can actually show us the numbers and come up with the models and kind of pull back the curtain on things is going to be enormously valuable. So I'm looking forward to it. So welcome aboard. You have no idea what's waiting for you, but it's going to be fun watching it.
No pressure.
None at all. All right. I think that's the introduction to the new employee. So Stephen, if you wanted to take the agenda for us.
Sure. So the first thing I do want to say is welcome, Cyrus. And what we are going to do is, pull back the curtain in terms of the models and have a look at how those models work, how we affect them, and how we start building out collateral portfolios. So that is the essence of it, and that's where we're going to draw on not only Cyrus's experience and expertise, but quite a few folks that are actually on this call as well. We're going to draw on their expertise as well, and come out with very innovative ways of looking at risk management. But the one thing I need to really sort of jump into now is have a look at the stability fee, and we need to ask a couple of questions. The first one was we changed the stability fee last week. Was it in any way effective? Do we have any evidence on that? Do we have enough data to identify that there is something specific to the changes or the trends that are in the ecosystem as a whole? When should the next change happen? My initial suggestion would be probably next week. And the manner in which we're going to do it is hopefully reverting back to the previous idea of having everyone in this call come to a certain level of agreement. You can call it rough consensus or not, and then get this onto a governance polling. So onto a governance polling so that we can get full representation from the broader community. Once that polling passes, we immediately go into an executive vote and then pass the stability fee change if we need. Now, to that point, the other thing we need to try and consider is the extent of the stability fee change. Do we do another 0.5%, or do we jump 1%? Something we need to consider clearly. Then the other interesting risk parameter that's getting a lot of attention is the debt ceiling. Currently, looking at CoinMarketCap or looking at the maker tools that we have, you can see we're hitting on the 90 million. This is the most we've ever had in our history. And considering the debt ceiling is at 100 million, what should we do? Should we extend the debt ceiling? These are the questions that we need to really consider. But before we do, we need to try and inform ourselves in terms of what data we have and what it can tell us. Now, I don't know if Lev is in the meeting, but if not, we can also just start with the foundation risk team's data. And Joe, are you there? Is it possible for you to sort of present the data that we have?
Yep, I'm here. I have a couple of things that Lev gave me, so I'm gonna give him that.
Oh, super.
Total credit goes to him and Pavel. I will present the. There's a couple things. Here's the governance page, and this is going to be updated to the second every single time. So on a go-forward basis, I'm putting it in right here, so you guys can see exactly the graphs that we have. So the DAI governance. So you can see like the DAI active addresses has gone up, percentage of DAI on exchanges kind of in terms of trading has gone up. Oasis, obviously, because of the change we've made into DAI, has kind of come down a little bit. exchange volume there, die circulation. The big one I would say is this is Pavel's, which I think is really good. This will be integrated into the governance die glitch me, but he came up with it. Is this one right here?
Joe, can you screen share?
Hey Joe, yeah, can you share your screen?
No problem. I just put them in the chat too, so I'll share my screen.
I think it's just the die.stablecoin.science domain, right? Or URL, I mean, right?
Yeah, I use the one you put in your Twitter, Chris. There you go. So here's the one for that we have on the governance die. This one's going to be updated going forward basis. It updates should update every day after this meeting. So we load the graphs. But it will show you the different readouts, but also if you go to Pavel's and Lev's and Chris's, you'll see that nothing's really changed on where DAI is trading. There's been a couple flickers up, but really nothing. I mean, I think there's really nothing has changed. And that's why I'm advocating for the increase. So.
Yeah, so I have two questions for you, Joe, from the perspective of a trader, right?
Yep.
First of all, how are your inventory levels now and compared to, let's say, a month ago? And then secondly, are you seeing like any sort of like like in terms of like trading desks and so on, like demand for buying DAI? Are you seeing more demand sell DAI, right? And sort of like in the general direction of how that's going.
I see a lot of sells for DAI. Our inventory is actually up because I've accommodated a couple of people that needed to get out for trades, and I've not seen a difference. I've just seen on the offer people wanting to sell DAI, and not talking hundreds of thousands. I'm talking millions of DAI.
One thing did clean up on Coinbase Pro 1 week ago. It would take about $170,000. That's how much capacity was the difference between what it was trading at 98 cents and change, all the way to $1. And as of right now, that number is around 63,000.
Yeah.
So while the prices still hasn't really materially moved, the amount of supply it would take to move the market has been cleaned out.
I went on there. As part of our drive to keep everything around $1, because we're finally getting our market making operations back up to normal here, and I drove up the DAI USDC price to try to get up there, but you will see over the next couple of days that inventory go away too. But there's also something called iceberg orders that are in there too, which you encounter, which you see, like if you look at it, it's like 500. It'll show 500, but there'll be another 500 behind it, another 500 behind it. So, the inventory's changed a little bit, but there's still a lot of icebergs there. But going back to your question, Rune, really no change, and that's why I want the increase.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe, if you're still, are you still screen sharing? Because
yep.
Are you done with the presentation?
Right here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm done. Yep. But
did you have a question?
Yeah, so basically in conclusion, right now, your inventory levels have been way above the target ever since you did that presentation on the target, like months back, basically. And even though we've done a number of stability fee increases, you have seen no impact at all, right?
No difference. Nope.
Yeah, so I think, that's in addition to the fact that we can look at the DAI stablecoin science, we can kind of look at the implied price of DAI on decentralized exchanges, and then we can also check out Coinbase, and we can see how it's still underpriced there. Then also that, then we have market making inventory. That's kind of like the third type of thing we can look at. Basically, it's clear. First of all, it's clear that the stability fee increases we've done so far haven't had much impact. And also, my general impression is that we are at this almost breaking point now, where there are people who are stopping to use DAI because they feel the peg is too weak, right? So we are right on the edge of a I mean, kind of like a dangerous feedback loop, right? Where like the weakening of DAI actually causes it to weaken further, and we get like a speculative drop in the price essentially. So and this has already been discussed quite a bit on Reddit as well, right, over the past couple of weeks. So there's actually a lot of people who are out sounding the alarm on this, right? And we discussed this last week as well. And I think the only thing we can do at this point is we need to make a very drastic stability fee increase to really show like commitment to actually protecting the peg no matter what.
All right, well, let's try and put some parameters around that. So we've talked about the 50 basis points on a weekly cadence, and we've seen that that's not providing forward guidance to the rest of the community, and it's not moving the needle. So do we need to change the rate, or do we need to change the step? Do you feel that it's the actual fee that needs to go up? The rate is fine.
Yes, I would say that. I mean, I think that like Stephen is suggesting, right, that we should start to do governance polls around this. So we really need to ensure that there is proper decision made by the entire community for this. So first of all, I think we need to increase the number of votes for what we're doing, especially if we want to increase the magnitude, like sort of change the magnitude of stability fee changes. And then I think with that, I think it basically makes sense to have this bi-weekly cadence, because today we definitely cannot go out and immediately do an executive vote and try to actually change the stability fee today. I think what we can do is we can set up a governance poll today and then use that to justify an executive poll a week from now.
All right, well, that raises an interesting question as well, because the governance polling mechanism, it allows us to have more than one poll, right? So should we put out one for like raise it to 1%, raise it to 2%, raise it to 3%, see what the community feels, or do we pick a number?
Yeah, I think what we do is we say either do you want to keep it at well, I mean, I think theoretically we should allow people to vote for no change. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is for sure, right, is that no one here believes we should stick. Well, I mean, let's see, right? But I definitely think that there's very little reason to continue with 0.5% increases. It's kind of a waste of time and sort of a waste of voting energy to some extent, right? But I also believe that it needs to be possible for people to actually, again, like it's really about like signaling and sort of if someone out there actually has data that there's plenty of demand coming or something, and it's silly to increase the stability fee now, there should be a way for them to like probably signal that, and that I think theoretically there basically needs to be an ability to vote no to a stability fee increase in a governance poll, right? So we can say that it's not the governance meeting that decided this change. It's actually like decided to do an executive vote for a stability increase. It's actually a governance poll that then authorized an executive vote on the stability fee increase. So
we have some deeply engaged fund managers and analysts in the call, so maybe we can start polling this community at least to see if there's any good suggestions, or if they can offer any insight to how they've perceived the market in the last week and what they feel a new stability fee would be worth examining. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Is there anyone who feels like these 0.5% increases have actually worked, or there people that feel like we should do a more drastic increase?
So to
make a stronger statement.
To start off with that slew of suggestions, my first suggestion is that I think we should do just 0.5% or 50 basis point increase, and here's my reasoning why. It actually has to do with the debt ceiling. I would suggest not to increase the debt ceiling, so therefore it does give a sense that supply will be curtailed. I get the sense that most of the supply we're seeing now are folks getting slightly more comfortable with an increase in the ETH price and therefore creating more DAI. I am of the opinion that the debt ceiling not being moved might be a good data point to the sort of leverage effect on curtailing supply. But as I said, that's my data point in this. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would argue against that, mainly on the basis that there has really been no expectation set that we would use the debt ceiling like for monetary policy, right? So
But
there's a good chance that this is like this also sets a precedent that in the future we'll try to control the price with the debt ceiling.
Oh, hang on a second. I'm not stipulating that the debt ceiling is used as monetary policy. I'm looking at the debt ceiling in terms of the collateral and the whole system, the system as a whole. It just so happens that that is an externality that we need to consider.
So I have a question. When we hiked the fee to 2.5%, did we see an observable effect at that time in the DAI exchange rate?
Yeah, but that probably was more caused by the markets turning around. So the thing is, when we increased the fee to 2.5%, it just coincided with the markets starting to really crash. And then when we slashed the fee to 0.5%, it just happened to coincide with when the markets turned around. So unfortunately, in both cases, we don't have any, like there's too much noise to figure out what the effect of the 2% change was, basically. Because it was really like ridiculously right on the turn of the market in both cases. It was quite absurd, actually, that it ended up playing out like that.
Yeah, and running experiments is going to be difficult in this environment. One thing that I have a question about is the debt ceiling right now. Is it still at 100?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so in which case, if we're to increase, so let's just say hypothetically we increase by 1%, right, two 50 basis points increases. We continue to see the markets for ETH do well. People create more CDPs. We hit against the debt ceiling. No more DAI is created. Let's see, maybe we observe the market reacting to that with DAI shooting up above the $1 peg. There's a shortage of DAI. There's not enough out there. People maybe want to close their CDPs or do whatever with it. Are we then comfortable if we observe DAI trading above doing 1.5% decrease again, or does that start to seem erratic? I'm just trying to think like, okay, let's say we raise 1%, we don't see an observable effect, but the debt ceiling comes into effect because we're only 10% away at this point, right? And 90 million DAI. What are we comfortable doing at that point?
Yeah, so I would say that first of all, I think we should increase the debt ceiling because I don't think that there's like the $100 million number is arbitrary and was really set on technical risk and not on market risk. So I think, and this is kind of like the second thing. I think we were talking about splitting this meeting up into two parts, right? Where the second part is focused on the long-term risk parameters. So I think there's plenty of room to increase the debt ceiling. But the second thing is, I think it's so incredibly important that we really learn to stabilize DAI with interest rate increases, right? Like, so what we could do is we could set the debt ceiling, we could decrease the debt ceiling today, right? And we could use that to make sure that there's just no CDP, like you can completely stifle CDP creation right now and use that to kind of like try to get the peg under control. But the problem is just this, then we'll always have this, like we'll have even less understanding of how to use the stability fee to control the peg with, right? So
one thing that I would throw in there though, given how early we are, right? We're going to be, say, a bit more elementary with how we control things. And one interesting thing that I find with the debt ceiling is right now we have native demand for DAI building, right? Really in DeFi, I would say, and I think we're going to see more of that. And so while that native demand for DAI is building, the debt ceiling is a way, I agree, to arbitrarily constrain supply, but it's a way to allow us to not have a DAI supply glut while native demand for DAI is building. So I wouldn't see it as a precedent. I would see it more as a representation of where we are currently. If the most important thing, right, is making sure that DAI doesn't break too strongly from its peg.
I want to make sure that we're all on the same page too about the reason why we have a debt ceiling, and even if that number was arrived at semi-arbitrarily, there is reasoning that implies that ceiling is there because in the case of a rapid downturn in the price of Ethereum, we need to liquidate this collateral, right? And if we start raising that that debt ceiling in order to just give us more breathing room, we need to consider that risk. And Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but were there numbers calculated to determine what the actual, like the real liquidity of Ethereum is across
No, so
exchanges?
here's it. So just to give the context of this story, like I actually have the actual context where I was said, and it was entirely set based on technical risk. So this number, the debt ceiling number, was initially set at 50 million, based around the idea that this was like we were thinking about the worst case scenario where the system would get hacked, and at the time we were very uncomfortable with launching a system, and we'd done security audits, but single collateral DAI has not been formally verified. So this number is entirely focused on the risk of the system getting hacked, essentially. So and the reason why it's 100 million is because we started at 50 million, so that was kind of like the arbitrary number we'd already done once. So we just did the same increase with the same number again, sort of without. It was not based around this is any sort of liquidity risk. It was again like this is how like we don't want an infinite debt ceiling because there's some technical risk in the system getting hacked. In terms of like market depth and anything like that, there's actually been no real analysis into that done in terms of like how much the absolute maximum is where we have to globally settle a system, which is something that's like I really want to drive home, right? Is that the expectation that has always been set is that the debt ceiling is this kind of like technical barrier that protects against some weird, like either against something like a hack of some sort, right? So to prevent a hacker to be able to just like print infinite DAI. And also just like to prevent some sort of freak accident or like irrational behavior where also just like a ton of DAI is created out of nowhere very suddenly. But what like the number in terms of, especially in single collateral DAI, like the number that is sort of like this is the maximum limit of the size of the system we will go to, right? That number is not determined by the debt ceiling in that sense, because it's that number is really at the like a question of when are we gonna do an emergency shutdown of the system, because there's no such thing as like we set the debt ceiling here and we just decide that that's how big the system will grow, because we can't control that, because demand will grow however the hell it wants to grow, right? And the problem is if we set the debt ceiling as a fixed number and demand just grows beyond that, that just means we have to do an emergency shutdown. We either have to increase the debt ceiling or do an emergency shutdown, right? There's no such thing as like we set the debt ceiling at this number and then somehow we control demand by doing that. So that's again why like the debt ceiling is not really it should not be viewed in this way as kind of like this policy instrument, or really something that helps us control much of the system. Which again, why I think it's just like it would kind of just be the wrong direction to go to try to suddenly like change that fundamental, like the fundamental strategy of how we control the system, right? Instead of talking about the debt ceiling and so on, we need to talk about large changes in stability fee. And I think what I think is like the easiest thing to go to, right, is that we say we keep this regular cadence, but we go to another number that we've used it for before, right? So 2%. And then we can do a governance poll to basically see whether people want to do a 2% raise or not do any change at all, right? And then if it turns out that there are a lot of people who apparently are very confident that there's a lot of more DAI demand coming, then we can kind of like revisit and maybe try to do another change or something like that, right? But like I think it's really critical that we do something now, and we do like basically this is what's been set up for already, right? That we've set the stage that we're going to do more serious changes in the system, and we can even do a governance poll for it, and we have all the data on our side and so on. And then it's like in reality, I would like if I could just change the stability fee. I think it should be 4% change, at least 3%, maybe 4%. And I don't
Okay,
even
so I
think
just want to make sure
that would be enough.
that I haven't lost the thread here, because we have two things that are happening here. We have an inventory issue, but we're also rapidly approaching a debt ceiling issue. And if we are going to prioritize a change in the stability fee, I want to make sure that I've completely understood that that's also going to solve our debt ceiling issue. And if it's not, then we can't lose sight of these two conversations, right? Like, is the feeling that raising this is going to fix our debt ceiling issue?
No, so this point is super important. So I'm going to try and it's very difficult to make this point. But the thing is, the debt ceiling issue is entirely a demand side issue. So like the thing that's scary about the debt ceiling is that if at some point demand catches up with the debt ceiling, the peg breaks upwards, right? Because there's more demand for the amount of DAI that's in circulation, and there's no way to generate more DAI because we've hit the debt ceiling. So the stability fee doesn't actually do anything about that either, because the stability fee doesn't affect demand, right? The stability fee only affects supply. But what this also means is that while the supply right now is very close to the debt ceiling, because we're in this situation where the market makers have too much inventory and the peg is too low and so on, the demand is actually not anywhere close to 100 million. So this is also this is what Stephen was referring to, in the sense that what we could do is we could just like do a small increase now and just let the supply actually hit the debt ceiling. And then if we just wait and we just let it sit there, the debt ceiling, eventually demand should catch up. But that's like, I basically think these are two completely separate issues, and they're kind of like the debt ceiling issue is sort of a technical, and it's a technical assessment of whether we are comfortable with increasing the debt ceiling further. And then it's basically a market depth assessment of whether we are ready to do an emergency shutdown of the system when it reaches $100 million in size, or whether we do not want to do an emergency shutdown at that point and we want to let the system continue to grow, in which case we increase the debt ceiling. But that is really, like, that is totally separate to this more fundamental problem of we have to figure out how to get the peg under control with the stability fees. And we really can't escape that. Like, we have to just do these changes until it works. And like, without that, the fundamental sort of logic of using governance to control the system just fails, right? So I really don't see it as an option to kind of like, let's say, be afraid of doing a large stability fee increase and then try to do some trick that's not really how governance is supposed to be done, right? And how the expectations have been set around it. But rather we just have to do a big increase. And again, yeah, probably the big increase is 4% or something easily. I could see that be the case. If you look at, there's this interesting articles comparing MakerDAO rates to other DeFi rates, right? And how everything else is like in the 8% range, at least. That would be great, right? But that would be too much of a shock. However, the 2% changes have been done in the past. And what we can do now is we can just set up this expectation that there's going to be this regular cadence of 2% increases until we start seeing an effect. Because if we start doing 2% increases, there's definitely going to be an effect at some point. There's just no way that won't happen.
All right, well, that's a good place to. I really want to encourage the community to start chiming in. So, like I said earlier, we have one confirmation here. We have Matthew, who's always been very vocal. So,
can I say a couple
obviously,
things?
we now have Cyrus, and I was just about to hand it over to you. So
yeah. So as I understand it, obviously the stability fee is low, and it's led to a lot of cheap credit. A lot of people taking out near interest-free loans, which is, with the ETH price being low, it's basically allowed a lot of people to go, lever up, at reasonably good rates. Now, I think that by increasing the debt ceiling, without solving the peg crisis, we're accommodating more of this cheap leverage. And so I think the peg needs to be under control first. At the same time, if we hit the debt ceiling before we fix the peg, then we're risk conflating our policy tools, and we're no longer we're no longer able to evaluate the effect of our fee increase. If we hit the debt ceiling before we fix the current 98 cent problem, then DAI rises, and then we don't really know what the stability fee should be. At which point we have to.
Sorry, yeah, I agree that we shouldn't confound our variables or change two things at once, because we're not going to get a clear signal from that. But is there going to be a situation where we don't have that luxury because we're popular and we're cheap? But you obviously said that we're out competing everybody as a credit facility, and that might be the problem, right?
Right. So I mean, I agree with Rune that we should increase the fee somewhat aggressively so that we can kind of fix the 98 cent problem before we hit the debt ceiling. But yeah, if we hit the debt ceiling first, then we're going to have to increase it so that we could kind of see what the natural market price of DAI is, so we can make further policy changes. Is that correct?
Yeah, Rich, what you were saying a moment ago, I mean, for me personally, I kind of dispute the idea that you shouldn't do two things at the same time. I mean, I 100% agree with what you're just saying, Cyrus, that you can't have a scenario where you hit your debt ceiling. What you were mentioning, Rune, about hitting the debt ceiling, it's no different than lifting up a bucket of water and then dropping it, trying to figure out where it's going to splash. You always want to make sure that thing gets pushed 20% out in the future, more than way more than we're not going to hit it unless somebody takes out some massive CDP. That said, we're in the scenario, we're not in an efficient market, right? I mean, that's a really important component. It's rapidly changing. So if we need to increase the rates more than 50 bips, then do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because I've actually given the same speech to somebody in Reddit recently, that we're not dealing with the Fed here. We're dealing with an enormously small micro crypto economy that the influences and the confounding variables that control it are completely misunderstood from everybody. So aggressive action is important. I guess the trap to fall into from a technical perspective is you always want to isolate variables. Perhaps that's not the best practice when it comes to finance, though.
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, I just want to make one quick point. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Alex, first.
Yeah, so my question was around how the debt ceiling is enforced. Am I understanding this correct, Rune, that it's not actually, is it actually enforced at the smart contract level? In other words, let's say this, like, we're 99.999 or whatever, and I just do a draw transaction to pull out some DAI.
You just can create DAI, yeah.
With that, I will create the DAI.
Yeah, it's happened before too.
So it's only really enforced by global settlement. It's not, so we can exceed and then the question is, like, the market calls our bluff, and are we actually going to globally settle the system or increase it? So it doesn't sound like the debt ceiling is at all an option here, right?
So let me. I think I need to explain a little bit more, because I think I confused a little bit. Like, so there's a lot of dynamics around the debt ceiling, right? And first of all, it is true that once we hit it, it just programmatically means you cannot draw any more DAI until someone else pays down the CDP. So that's one thing. And another thing is I want to make clear is that if we actually hit 100, like if we go to 100 million DAI tomorrow, and we hit the debt ceiling, and like the DAI peg is still broken and so on, then absolutely we should not increase it. But the thing is that if another 10 million DAI, like, the thing is, we're at this tipping point right now. We're kind of standing pretty much as an edge, right? And as we could hear from Joe, right, his inventory is totally full, right? He's no more capital to buy more DAI with, right? And there's a lot of other traders out there who are in the same situation. They're all trying to get rid of their DAI. At this point in time, if we saw another 10 million DAI getting, like, basically dumped onto the market, it would really be like, it would be an even bigger, like, it would be almost like disaster at that point, right? Because then it would really be like serious loss of faith in the system, right? So I'm definitely not, like, that's one thing to consider, right? And the other thing is, it's not that the moment that the supply hits the 100 million debt ceiling and you can no longer draw any more DAI, that suddenly there's a chance that the peg will break upwards. Like, the way you should actually think of it is kind of like there's these two kind of like aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? So, like, right now supply is at 90 million. Like, in the foundation prop trading desk inventory, there's something like 15 million DAI or something, right? So at least, like, organic demand is at least like 50 million below the 90 million supply number, right? And in reality, it's probably even less, because there's a bunch of other market makers out there who also, are just sitting with a ton of DAI they want to get rid of, but no one wants to buy it, right? So once the debt, like, the thing is, once supply hits 100 million, that doesn't cause the price increase. That actually only happens once entire demand catches all the way up and then does that, right? So aggregate demand actually has to exceed 100 million before there's any chance of the peg breaking upwards. So it's definitely not an issue that, like, we have to be, like, we don't have to, like, the debt ceiling is not this ticking bomb waiting to happen, in a sense that the moment it's hit, something bad happens. It's only when demand catches up. And the good news is that demand is right now the thing that's very low compared to supply, right? But the problem is that you could, like, the reason why I'm against, like, using the debt ceiling as a policy tool is because it's kind of this, like, it's not really a long-term solution to some extent, right? Or, like, because it doesn't give us an indication of where the right, like, what the right stability fee should be in the system. So the problem is that even if we, like, let's say we decrease the debt ceiling right now, we would still kind of be in a situation where it's just too cheap, and there's just like it would be this weird, instead of it being, like, the market was kind of set this weird rate of, like, the waiting in line to get a sort of some free debt ceiling. But what we need to find is a better and more realistic stability fee that reflects basically the supply and demand in the market, right? And I think we just we could theoretically try to increase the debt ceiling or solve the problem with by decreasing the debt ceiling or something like that, but it just takes us further away from the fundamental problem that must be solved anyway, no matter what. And that really is kind of without being able to have a handle on that problem, there's just nothing that that we can't really get anything done, right? So
okay, so sorry, Rune, we're at the 45-minute mark. 50-minute left mark, and I want to make sure that we leave these calls with a clear understanding of what it is we've discussed and what the next steps are. So I want to take this opportunity to kind of revise or go through the agenda questions that we identified at the outset, ensure that we've actually come to some conclusions on these things, and figure out what it is we're going to do with the governance polling next, I think. So the first question on our agenda was the last change effective? And I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously, at least in my mind, no, it wasn't effective. And so that leads us to believe that this cadence that we've been on is not moving the needle, it's not affecting the market, and it's not acting as forward guidance. So we need to figure out how to make a bigger splash, I think. The second question we had on our agenda was, do we have enough data to identify a trend? I think from my perspective, and I would love somebody to pipe up and correct me, I don't feel that we're there yet. And Joe, maybe you have some insight, but do we feel that we have a clear trend that we can look at here, or are we still sort of looking for signal and noise?
I don't see anything, no change at all. So that's why I was.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just want to make sure I didn't misunderstand. So the third question on our agenda was, when is the next change going to happen? And Brune, you spoke to that earlier, that the cadence that we have seems to be all right. You mentioned bi-weekly though. Do you mean so every 2 weeks, twice a week? Which bi-weekly are you referring to?
yeah, I think what we got to do is every other week we have a governance poll, and then every other week we have an executive vote. And we should it should be kind of like a temporary but the fact is we need to get something done. We need to dramatically increase the stability fee, probably by more than 2%. But I think if we get it this cadence at a 2% increases, we should be in good shape to at some point hit the. I really think we should start hitting the point where people start closing the CPs. That's actually, unfortunately, the place we need to get to, I think.
So
I agree.
on,
Go ahead.
on the stability fee point for a second, I think it would be helpful to think of it in the context of the overall market and Maker as a credit facility, right? Because we want people to close out their CDPs or to go to other places for credit, then we need to make, at least for now, Maker no longer, say, the lowest cost credit facility out there. And so it might be helpful, instead of thinking of it in isolation, thinking of it relative to the other credit facilities in the market, so that we can play that dynamic, and maybe people will go to other places to get their leverage or their credit or whatever it may be, and so therefore they'll close out their CDPs or they won't create more.
Yeah, if the assumption is we're sharing the same customer base, I guess, as the rest of the collateralized or credit facility markets, then we need to approach compound rates, I guess, is probably the lowest one out there. So that should factor into the step that we're going to make, or the number of basis points we're going to increase. So I guess the next question in my mind is, how do we determine what that governance poll is going to look like that we kick off? I'm concerned that we'd be pressured into making that determination in this call. So is it feasible that we take this discussion to Reddit and then we spend the next 24 hours debating what that poll would look like? Does anybody have any suggestions about that? Or are we fine with just kind of in this call deciding that 2 or 4 is going to be the next governance poll, and then we'll see what the reception is to that?
I think we should, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a discussion on Reddit about it, right? But
Yeah.
I think the starting point should be we've tried in the past, we've done 0.5% changes in the past, and we've got 2% changes in the past, right? So I think we can't I think we should basically see is there arguments for why it should be something different than 2% increase, because what I expect is that no one has any idea what it should be, right? The only thing that we have sort of an idea of is that it should be more than what it currently is. So it makes sense to kind of fall back on then just something that's happened before, just because again it's yeah, like I mean, it's going to basically be like a lot of change for the community, right? So trying to sort of stick to things that at least have happened before, I think is ideal.
Okay, so we'll take that discussion to Reddit then. The last major agenda item that we had here was it's really open-ended, but it's like, what are we going to do about the debt ceiling? And I'm not entirely sure that I've come back with a summary here. So is the idea that it's our hope that aggressive changes in the stability fee will obviate the need to consider the debt ceiling problem? Or should we, well, actually, I'm going to throw my own suggestion here instead of a recap. So it feels like we need some data here because arbitrary is a scary word for me. So would it behoove us to actually get some hard data by the next call about exactly what a debt ceiling the market would support and our ecosystem would support, and maybe use that to inform this discussion in the future?
If you do what Rune said, and if you raise the rates significantly, you're now going to force a lot of upward pressure on buying DAI so people can pay back their CDPs and get out of the hole from paying a 6% fee. So that's obviously going to lift it a lot on, like, in an organic way, which should lower the proximity to the debt ceiling in a more natural way. But I think like that range, like what Rune's suggesting, it's like multivariate split testing, and we're all just throwing darts at, blindfolded. There's not enough like statistical significance anywhere to sort of poke its head out about what is the indicating factor. The biggest indicator that you could make a change on is not going to be duration based, which is what we're looking at, periodic changes. When like time is not what's, affecting the metric, it's activity, and we've got to discover what that activity is. But in the short, like if we are doing that, I think Rune's spot on that you need to close the range. So, all right, we went all the way down to 0.5%. Okay, it's not there. Let's go all the way up to 5% or 6, whatever it is, 4%. You get a more healthy indicator, and the byproduct of raising it means you're organically going to push things upwards because people have got to pay back their CDPs. And
yeah, I think that's obviously the anticipated result. I think that we should also consider too that there's going to be some fallout here. So we need to communicate this to the rest of the community that, like, hey, surprise, your dirt cheap credit facility is now no longer dirt cheap, right?
That's true. And just, I think it's like, I totally agree. One thing I would say that I feel like everything is still, everyone's learning multi-collateral DAI. This is year 1 of being public, or just going into year 2 of being public with DAI. It's a massive learning curve, and the lessons are only going to get more expensive as the debt ceiling raises, as like the stakes are going to get higher and higher. So if anyone is reluctant, just consider that trying this when it's a $200 million debt ceiling and the markets are more aggressive and different. Consider that. Sorry for the rant. Thanks.
No, that's good insight. So I want to make sure that is sort of representative. So is the general feeling in the room here for now that stability fee, short, sharp shock potentially plan for the next poll and then the next executive vote is going to be the next step before we start considering anything more drastic?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what I've already said about this, right? That like the way we equalize supply and demand should be with a stability fee, not with a debt ceiling, right? And the thing is that if we accept that we're going to align supply and demand of the system using a stability fee, that makes the debt ceiling, like setting something like, let's say, saying that 100 million is our absolute limit in terms of debt ceiling is the same as saying that if the system reaches 100 million in size, we're going to do an emergency shutdown. So it's just very important that that's the frame for like gathering data and sort of making the decision. It's based around, it's not around like that this is a size we want the system to take, and then we can somehow control it and make sure it stays at that size, because that's not possible. The only possibility is to shut it down when it reaches that size. So it's basically like, I mean, I don't see it as being dangerous. I just see it as like a waste of time, because a lot of people would probably argue, let's keep it at 100 million right now, which I agree with, because the the peg is broken and so on, right? But probably once they realize that actually arguing that is the same as arguing that then if demand hits 100 million, then we shut down the system, right? And then at that stage, it starts like the significance of a decision like that has to really be properly considered, right? That actually what you're deciding is you're saying this is where we're going to shut the system down.
So to that point, which I agree with, that point has a presumption that we are at a sort of robust point. We're at a critical mass where a debt ceiling does take on that very technical definition. But in the manner, in the temporal form, in the manner of actually considering where we are now to getting to where we need to be, there could be a suggestion to the point that the debt ceiling takes on more than that. It has more to do with the economic construct and how we bootstrap it, as well as the liquidity risk that we're facing with respect to just the collateral and how it performs in the economy that we are operating in as well. So, to that end, I get what you're saying with respect to what the debt ceiling should be seen as. But in terms of where we are now, it may take on a broader perspective or a broader characteristic. And are we saying that we shouldn't allow for that broader characteristic because it can, whilst bootstrapping, getting to critical mass, help us? Or is it a case of saying we're going to set an undue precedent that we're not going to be able to get away from?
I think for me, it's just what I think is the most important is that we can't be complacent around learning to use the stability fee to stabilize the peg. So, probably the easiest is just be like, well, let's not even worry about the debt ceiling until we fix the peg, right? Which I kind of like, and even if we hit, and then if we hit the debt ceiling, which would be really bad, and we hopefully that doesn't happen, right? Then we will keep it there until again we fix the peg, and only once the peg has been fixed do we start worrying about increasing the debt ceiling. But just once again, but again, it's just like it's very dangerous, or not dangerous, but it's so more like pointless to start discussing 100 million debt ceiling as sort of the absolute target, unless people are willing to commit to doing an emergency shutdown once the system reaches that size.
All right, so we're dangerously close to the top of the hour, and a lot of people have hard stops. So what I want to do with this call, we've identified a lot of really interesting questions. We had a lot of very interesting suggestions, but obviously the debate needs to pile beyond the confines of this call. So I discussed earlier, actually before we started recording, I discussed that we're going to start, we have a process to get transcripts generated for these calls. Within 24 hours, we have a summary. Some team members have graciously stepped up to summarize some of the most important points. So I'm going to take those two resources, combine them together, start a Reddit post, and we can continue this conversation specifically from this call. So we'll go over, I'll outline the agenda items, I'll outline some of the major takeaways that we determined, and then we'll continue the discussion there about what the governance poll is going to look like and the timing on that, and start tossing around ideas for a potential new stability fee.
Real quick before we move to the Reddit discussion, just one thing from a community member's perspective, I fully agree with all the conclusions you guys are making here, and I agree, Rune, that the stability fee raise should be more dramatic, but conveying this in plain English to the broader community as to why that's needed when they go on CoinMarketCap and see that DAI is at 1.01, that's what most people do. Just making sure that that is conveyed clearly as to why this is required, I think is going to be really important moving forward.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And that's I kind of touched on that earlier when I was raised that concern that we need to warn people that we're about to compete ourselves out of the market for safety.
Well, actually,
so people need to understand why that is.
The underlying structure of that is, first agreeing on what the DAI exchange policy rate looks like.
Yeah, and I think there's these 3 points, right? There's the implied rate on decentralized exchanges. There's the USDC rate on Coinbase, and there's market maker inventory levels. And all of these seem to be pointing in the same direction. And then we've also concluded that a small change has no effect. So that's why we should go to a larger change. One last thing I want to say before we leave, right, is I think we should take the governance discussion to this is actually an old subreddit that was made ages ago, but it's MKR.gov. So that we actually have a more, because I'm afraid that people don't really have I think we should do kind of like cross post to MakerDAO, but ultimately try to gather the conversation, like the most serious conversation in one spot. because otherwise I'm afraid that it'll not be as easy to kind of like stay focused on that, because yeah, MKR. I mean, I'm gonna put it here in chat, right? MKR,
Let's play with that idea and see if we can. This is part of a larger discussion we've been having with the governance team about venues where we have debates, how we formalize those discussions, and whether we break away now, break away later. So let's talk about it after the call, Rune, and we'll figure out what the best location is for this.
In general, I think MakerDAO. I mean, it's awesome, right? But MakerDAO has gotten a little bit noisy recently, I feel. So this would definitely be a good opportunity, I think.
All right, so let's stick a fork in it there. This was a very energetic meeting, so I'm super happy about that. I'll send out, or keep an eye, actually, we don't have a push notification system in MakerDAO yet, which we're going to need sooner or later, but keep an eye on the subreddit for notification about this debate and potential information about where that debate will happen if it's not in our subreddit, and then we can continue on and figure out what the next steps are. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time. Thanks for all of your insights, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Rune. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.